Hello everyone and welcome to the show. I am the Maeve of all trades. Today I am going to be reading a little bit from Book 1 of Ladies of Camelot. I will be reading the prologue and the first 3 pages of Chapter 1. Knight of Camelot. Draft 1. A cry of pain shook the tiny room, packed full to bursting with midwives and serving ladies. One mopped the forehead of the screaming woman with cool water. 2 held her arms to keep her steady as her body tried to writhe into a position that wouldn't be as painful. The oldest woman was the one at the foot of the bed where the screaming woman lay. A blanket made of fine yellow and white thread was draped over her arms as she waited between her mistress's legs. Another wail rang out like the shriek of a banshee, melting from one cry into 2. The older woman stood, a squirming, screaming babe wrapped in the yellow and white blanket. There were gasps and coos from the other serving women as the oldest woman was handed a pair of shears, severing the child from its mother. Most everyone in the room assumed they knew what was coming next. The midwife would announce if it was a boy or a girl, and then hand it over to the mother. Nobody would ever suspect that the midwife would hold the babe close like a sack of stolen goods and run for the door. Most stood in shock. A few more of the level-headed ladies lunged for the old woman, only to fall short, fingers barely tracing her fine gray shawl as it danced past like the tail of a ghost. The new mother screamed again, struggling to get out of bed only to stumble and be forced to lay back down. Shouts and cries rang through the stone halls, alarms rising, orders for soldiers to move, to track down the thief at all costs. Though the inside of the castle was overcome with shouts, sobs, and agonizing pain, outside was utterly quiet. The only sound that persisted was the hollow call of a tin flute whispering in the wind. Chapter 1. 3 loud peals of a brass bell roused Mabon Delark from her sleep one foggy April morning. A yawn tugged at her jaw as she tumbled out of bed. She'd become an expert of ambling through her morning routine while still remaining half asleep, taking the unconventional practice of washing her face after dressing and tying up her hair rather than before. Occasionally, it resulted with a few small spills down her front, but it was a sacrifice she was willing to make for a few more minutes of relative unconsciousness. Besides, she was hardly wearing imperial silks, and it was only water. This was indeed what had happened that morning, and when she managed to shake herself out of the last dredges of slumber, she took note of a large wet spot on the front of her jerkin. Had she still been a young child, an error of this stature would have had her shaking like a goose on Christmas morning. But instead she merely sighed, her shoulders sinking just a bit lower than they already were, and the corners of her thin mouth dipped like the wildflowers weighed down by rain. Already she was playing it close to the collar, so it was either face a punishment for a damp jerkin, or face punishment for being half an hour late to breakfast. So with another sigh, she tied her rust-red hair into a braid and gave herself a final once-over. After determining she was presentable, aside from the water spill, she slipped out into the hallway. Already, she could hear the handful of servants her father had gossiping as they worked away in the kitchens. Her father's castle wasn't enormous, so no matter where Mabon was, she could always hear some kind of noise from the servants, either the day-to-day chatter as they hurried about with their duties, or their quickened footsteps as they dashed from one task to another. Her hands stayed firmly at her sides as she made her way down the halls, thinking back to when she was small and would let her fingers travel along the stone as she walked by, the other hand held by her father as he led her wherever he was going. Back then he would smile, sometimes chuckle at her more childish displays, but gradually the charm and the habit went away, and she learned to keep her hands at her sides or behind her back as she walked. Eventually, she arrived in the dining hall, easily the most extravagant room in the castle. Rich, colorful tapestries lined the walls, and an ornate rug lay beneath a long mahogany table, polished to an almost mirror shine, where her father was seated. Many times during her childhood, Mabon had wondered why they had such a grand dining hall and ballroom, and why their table had so many seats when the closest they'd ever had to a ball or a party had been when her father hosted 2 lords from nearby. Even then, she'd been confined to her chamber from the moment they set foot on their property. Perhaps her father was simply used to finer things in life before she was born, and hadn't wanted to give that up after they moved to their current home. She didn't know, and it wasn't her place to ask. Either way, the large room practically swallowed her father whole, dwarfing him despite the fact that he was easily one of the tallest people among them all, staff included. The only exception to this rule was Angus, her father's guard and Mabon's instructor. Even if her father was the height of a small boy, everyone agreed that the way he held himself commanded respect. Respect and obedience. He didn't look at Mabon as she stood by her usual chair, the first left by the head of the table, which was where he always sat. "Good morning, Father." Mabon broke the silence, her head very slightly bowed and her eyes cast downward. "Good morning, child," he replied, not looking up from the book in his hand. Mabon pursed her lips, a bead of sweat dripping down her neck at his tone. It wasn't anger per se, but it could very easily become anger if she did anything to provoke him. "Have I your permission to sit, Father?" she asked. This was what made him finally look at her. "Have you earned it?" She didn't answer. He'd done this before. He'd ask a question of her, and whatever her answer, it only made his temper worse, so the safest thing to do was not to say anything. Her father looked from her face to the front of her jerkin. "Care to explain the stain on your shirt?" he asked with a very slight nod of his head, which Mabon had come to learn meant that this was a safe answer. "I accidentally spilled some water on myself while I was washing," she explained, keeping her voice flat and unassuming. Her father sighed. "After I've reminded you over and over to be mindful while washing?" He paused, taking her silence as the only answer he needed. "Mabon, you are no longer a child, and I do not wish to keep treating you as one." "Understood, Father." "I'm not sure you do," her father replied, just as casually as if he were telling her which lessons she'd be having that day. Mabon swallowed. "We seem to have this conversation every morning, no matter how many times I've spoken with you about it. It leads me to wonder if you're simply ill-minded or if you're deliberately ignoring me." Mabon's heart went from the pit of her belly to her throat, but she managed to keep herself calm. "Neither, sir," she replied, the only outward sign of her anxiety being the very slight raise to her brows. "Then tell me why you feel the need to consistently ignore this particular responsibility," he replied, tilting his head again. "It is simply a desire to get to breakfast as quickly as possible. It would be improper to arrive late, and disrespectful to you, sir." She learned as soon as she was old enough to speak that explaining herself without his permission was akin to high offense to her father, and would usually earn her a vow of silence for a week rather than the rest of the day, which was his typical choice for her punishment, for her disrespect. "Is it not improper or disrespectful to arrive to breakfast with a stain on your front?" Damn, she wouldn't be wiggling her way out of this one. "Yes, sir," she replied, defeated. It was subtle, but the corners of her father's mouth quirked in triumph. "Normally I'd have you on a vow of silence for the rest of the week, but seeing as you'll be turning 25 at week's end, I suppose I'll make an exception." It took most of Mabon's willpower to not sigh in relief. Vows of silence were on the milder side of her father's preferred punishments, but she still wanted to avoid it. Mostly, she didn't want her father to be granted another failing of hers to stow away in his trove of things to lord over her. "Thank you, Father. Your graciousness is truly admirable." If you've stayed for this long, thank you so much for listening. Please leave a comment if you liked it. Please like the video and subscribe.